Welcome everyone. Myself Dr. Praveen Kumar Pathak with my colleague Manisha Sharma. Today we are going to discuss another important issue which is related with inequalities and sustainable development. The World Bank has classified different countries into various categories by their income levels. So broadly these categorizations exist in four groups. The first is low income countries, which the per capita income is below $1,000. Then you have low and middle income countries ranging from 1,000 to 4,000 US dollars. Then upper middle income countries where the per capita income varies from 4,000 to 12,000 US dollars. And finally the high income countries where per capita income is more than 12,000 US dollars. And broadly we can classify world based on their different level of development into three categories, developed countries, developing countries and the least developed countries. Now if you see the characteristics of regions which come from, say for example, developed part of the world. So most of the countries which are located in Europe, North America, Japan and Australia are basically classified as developed countries. So what is the characteristics of some of these countries? These are the countries where industrial activities are high. There is low level of agricultural activity on an average. Employment is largely exist in sectors which is related to service and manufacturing, and you have a very well developed healthcare systems. You have relatively lower level of infant and child mortality in some of these countries. Also we found that the education levels in some of these countries is very advanced. So the quality of education and access to education is almost universal in some of these countries. On the other hand, if you compare inequalities by social and economic dimensions between male and female is relatively lower, and the gross national product, which is per capita national income, is roughly more than 35,000 US dollars. So therefore these regions also figure into some of the top countries in terms of their human development index. So these are by and large characteristics of nations that we found to be categorized as high developed countries on the planet. On the other hand, if you compare these countries with some of the developing countries from the world, so most of these regions exist in the Southeast Asian economy. So for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, India, most of the South and Central American countries, for example Brazil, Mexico, Northern Africa, some of these countries such as Egypt. So these are emerging economies, rapidly developing economies, and particularly during the last 2 to 3 decades there's been rapid change in the economic improvement and advancement in some countries, largely triggered through manufacturing and service sectors, which has grown manifold in the last 2 to 3 decades. And the exploitation from multinational companies is looking for cheap labor is however is a bigger concern, because in most of this nation you have a young population and a population which is actually available for jobs at a relatively lower level. So the issues of labor laws and labor policy happens to be a concern in some of these countries. Also, if you see the national income in many of these countries is rapidly increasing. We have also seen that the healthcare systems in these emerging economies is also improving over the years, which has led to drastic decline in infant and child mortality in some of these countries in the recent decades, which has contributed to very significant progress in terms of the life expectancy in many of these emerging economies. If you take the case of India, we have made tremendous progress in the life expectancy, which was at the time of independence around 1947 only about 37 years, which has now reached a level of 69 years. So in the last 75 years, India has contributed on an average an increase of 32 years of average life for an average citizen in the country. On the other hand, if you look at education, these emerging economies have realized the importance of investing into education of their population. The best example is of course China. In the last 40 years, China has been investing more than 5 to 10% of their GDP in the education sector, now which has allowed this economy to take off thanks to advanced investment in education, skill building and health of its national, and it has been able to bear the fruit of the demographic dividend, wherein large chunk of its population, when it entered into the working age category through their advanced policies of investment, timely investment into education and skill building, has been able to reap the development, the demographic dividend benefits. And many of the other developing countries, emerging economies, for example Brazil, has not been able to deliver the similar results, partly because of the policies which were not as foresighted as the case of China. As far as gender inequalities between male and female exist, so it's a big concern in several of these emerging economies. And if you take case of whether India or South Asia or Asia as such, the biggest problem happens to be the son preference and daughter dispreference, and also the issues of females labor force participation, which is quite low and is declining over the period of time. So in many of these societies which are emerging economies, they are doing good as far as their industrial progress and technological development is concerned, but the issues of development with inclusive growth is a big challenge for many of these countries. And when I talk about big challenge, I mean that inclusiveness is a bigger issue here, whether it is from the perspective of gender, from the perspective of region or social backgrounds, people from various social backgrounds. So all these stakeholders must find their place in the development story of these emerging economies. And so therefore the result is that most of these emerging economy countries, they stand in the middle of the HDI score at the global level. However, if we look at some of the countries which are categorized as the least developed countries in the world today, and mostly they figure from African continent. So for example, Zambia or Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, or some of the Asian countries, for example, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal, etc. So most of these nations are categorized as least developed countries today. However, if you look at their manufacturing and service sector, we find that they are still lagging behind. Primarily, they depend on agricultural allied activities and foreign aids for their survival. Life expectancy happens to be still fairly less as compared to the global average, and of course, majority of the population is struggling with addressing the issues of poverty, deprivation, food security. So these are the biggest concern in most of these least developed nations of the world today. In addition, if you look at the healthcare system, is fairly very poor and weak, and basically it requires a lot of rejuvenation, and therefore disease is common, and we find that infant mortality levels in some of these least developed part of the world is extremely high, unfortunately. If you look at the central government, or if you look at the rule of government or democracy or institutions are fairly weak, many times they suffer from the malice of corruptions, and so therefore we also observe that there is a issue of lack of education, and both the quantity and the quality of education is a big problem, and particularly among women and girls. So therefore, because of all these constraints, as far as their economic growth, their the social inequalities, all put together, and of course lack of education and education systems, which is relatively weaker and absent in many part of these countries, has led to a situation where most of these least developed nations occupy relatively lower standing as far as the Human Development Index score is concerned. So hence we also find that many LDCs are heavily indebted or poor countries, so they are also known as heavily indebted countries in the world. So another category is the regions with heavy indebted poor countries, HIPCs. So 37 out of 31 of these countries happens to come from the sub-Saharan Africa. So these are extremely poor nations in the world. So basically, which means that virtually in most of these countries, out of 200 roughly 37 countries in the world where we have no industrial activity, mainly these people are depending upon subsistence form of farming. Virtually there is no healthcare systems in this country, and hence we observe that infant mortality are extremely high, and thus the life expectancy is very, very, very low. So the result is that the population education is less, gender inequalities are super high, per capita income is extremely low, they figure at the most lowest rung of the HDI score. Both poverty and diseases in many of these countries of HIPC's countries is very high, and therefore most of these nations are eligible for foreign debt relief measures, which basically aims to reduce the external debt to more manageable levels. So in basic sense, the idea is that majority of these nations and economies is largely supported through foreign aids for meeting their basic necessities of life of millions of people who happen to live in most of these countries. So basically if you had looked at these 3 to 4 categorization, it clearly says that countries are very unequal in terms of their economic activity, in terms of their social systems, in terms of their education, health systems, and so therefore the net result is that we find the human development and human capital formation is also very different. Now, in order to see that how situation can change in some of these countries where concerns are even very significant, I think economic development is the first starting point. So if you look at the economic development per se, it basically refers to a development that leads to change in the quality of life of its population, which includes not only economic growth, but translating this growth into improvement in the standard of its education, medical care, quality of diet, quality of living. So this all put together is an idea of economic development of any nation. And so therefore, greater a country's economic development, it is expected that the better the living standard of people should be in those countries. So the basic idea of this economic development and growth is influenced by Rostow's model, where how a society over a period of time transitions from a subsistence economy with investment in manufacturing and industrial sector over time specializes and expands economic activity and finally leads to a stage of mass consumption. This also goes in consonance with the demographic transition model, where the society which is a traditional agrarian society over time, with changing technology, with changing structure of economy and society, gradually transition from high equilibrium of mortality and fertility to a low equilibrium of mortality and fertility. And there is a transitioning period in between where there is a rapid increase in the population number, which gradually goes down. But mind you, these are not automatic changes. All these changes have to be managed by the national policies, demographic policies of, first of all, improving the health and therefore bring down mortality levels. Second is how to provide education and healthcare services for people so that they can make informed choices about their family sizes and family composition. And then finally, how to create a situation where people from every nook and corner of society has got access to means and information and knowledge so that they can achieve the family that they want or they choose. So that is how the model of demographic transition work. But of course this is not automatic, and it's very much depends on the policies that various countries adopt, and these policies have a significant role in towards influencing the economic development and the prospects of achieving sustainable development. So countries who invest well in advance in the demography of its population are able to reap the dividend of demographic transition, just like several East Asian tiger economies or even China to a large extent has been able to reflect in recent times. If you look at the epidemiological transition model, which was proposed by Omoran in 1971, is very much similar to what we had seen in the case of demographic transition. Here the difference is just that the burden of diseases are changing as the nature of society is also going under transition because of the process of economic development. So to begin with, we observe that there is a huge issues of infectious diseases, pandemics and infection, so life expectancy is less, and these are the characteristics which are related with societies which are traditional, agrarian, subsistence farming. And as society progress towards industries, manufacturing, advanced technologies. So similarly, the burden of diseases and the composition of diseases also undergoes significant change. So the change happens from infectious and communicable diseases to largely diseases which are related to non-communicable and lifestyle diseases, diseases which are chronic in nature. And as society becomes highly advanced and economically most prosperous, these diseases occupies a huge challenge for the economy. So for example, if you see many of these Western countries today where proportion of aging is rising, so there is an increase in the life expectancy of people for sure, but what quality of life the people are actually leading, that is a big question. So as aging is rising, the huge challenge for functional characteristics of population is there. So whether people are able to do their basic necessities in life themselves, or they require any formal care or support. And if there is a burden of non-communicable and chronic disease rising in a nation, so the nation has to invest tremendous amount of resources taking care of such citizens, and therefore planning in advance to take care of the health and well-being and promoting healthy lifestyle choices in the population is very critical. Because if the burden of disease in a population rises, for example tuberculosis, or for example diabetes, or chronic vascular diseases, all these kind of problems, if they are rising at the population level, it will have direct implications on the labor force participation and huge burden on the the exchequer of the state. And so therefore public health is directly related with the prospects of future prosperity and development. And so therefore society must invest into its education and lifestyle choices in public health. Preventive care is extremely critical, not only the curative part, which is of course important. So if we invest more into preventive care in our school curriculum, in our colleges and universities, so that people practice healthy lifestyle, yoga, mental health is a critical area. A lot of work needs to be done, and what we are eating, the quality of diet, etc., is very important. So hence societies which are able to manage its public health well, they are in a better position to go on the trajectory of higher prosperity and development than society which are not able to manage their public health. Now there are different indicators to measure the economic progress. The gross national product is there, of course, which is the total monetary value of all the goods and services that is produced in a country in a given year. But there is another important indicator known as genuine progress indicator. Now what is genuine progress indicator? So it does account for the GNP, which is total value of the goods and services produced in the country, plus whatever income the nationals have earned from other part of the world. At the same time, it also accounts for the negative externalities which are the byproduct of the process of development. So dear colleagues, you know that development is an outcome of the modification of the natural environment. Development will only happen when we modify the immediate natural environment, whether we exploit forest, or we exploit minerals, or we modify waters. So whatever we take from nature, so there is going to be a byproduct. Some wastage will be generated, some modification will be done. So all these negative effects are essentially not factored into when we calculate the GDP or GNP. So this genuine progress indicator is an alternative measure that actually accounts for both economic value of the goods and services that are produced by a country in a given year. At the same time, it also accounts for the negative impacts due to the economic activity, such as probably the cost of ozone depletion, maybe the cost of resource depletions, maybe social issues like crimes, etc., which may be related with economic activity. So when you account for both these positive and negative results, so the net outcome will be the genuine progress indicators. So the genuine progress indicator is a national level measure of economic growth and prosperity, and it is also an alternative to the GDP, but which accounts for the negative externalities such as pollution, etc. So GPI may be considered to be a better measure of growth from the perspective of green and social economy. Proponents of the GPI, genuine progress indicator, believe that it is a better metric as it provides a full view of the health of the nation. It doesn't only focus on the economic metrics, rather it also accounts for other negative externalities. So therefore it looks at how the health of the nation is actually evolving with time. However, if you look at the critics of this measure, they basically argue that GPI is too subjective, rendering it less effective tool to measure economic growth. So if you look at some of the components of the GPI, so you have economic indicators which of course are positive. On the other hand, there are a number of environmental indicators and social indicators, which some of them are positive, some of them are negative. So that's what this GPI does, is that as it is provided by the IMF, International Monetary Fund, so what they do is they account for both the positive and the negative externalities and come out with an aggregate scenario of how the national economy and society, and therefore overall national health of the nation, is transforming over the period of time. And therefore we also come down to HDI, which is again a very important measure to understand the people's ability to live a long and healthy life, to communicate and participate in the life of community, and to have a sufficient resources to obtain a decent life. So ultimately all these economic and social and health dimensions are basically meant for people to achieve their biological potentials. So there is a, if you go by this Saint's idea of capability approach, human capacity building, so the whole point is that to create an environment wherein each and every individual, depending upon their choices and interests, should be able to achieve the best they want for themselves. So that is the whole idea of HDI: better education, better health, and livelihood and economic opportunities. So you know that different countries are performing at various levels. This HDI scores varies from 0 to 1. So it basically based on the people needs. So there are 3 indicators: life expectancy, literacy, and standard of living. And if you look at countries in the world today, majority of these nations which are in Europe, Nordic countries, are probably the best countries as far as HDI is concerned. Now why is that these Nordic countries perform exceptionally well even compared to countries from other part of Europe or maybe North America? The reason being that many of these Nordic countries, they do very well on their health system, on their social equity systems. So even if somebody is located in a remote area, he or she, if there is a situation of health emergency, would get access to the best possible air ambulance, and he or she would be airlifted to the nearest possible health unit where he or she may be treated. Similarly, they have got one of the best education institutions in the world, and therefore with investment in quality education and health, they also have very different models of economic activities, not necessarily industrialization per se. And so the net result is that these countries are doing well, as contrast to several countries from global south in Africa and in India. So therefore addressing inequalities is very critical, and countries where inequalities are high, they are struggling to achieve the goals of sustainability. Thank you.